Hello friends, welcome to our channel, The Pain and Pride of Modern Homeowner Spirit. We are thrilled to have you join us on this journey of self-empowerment. Here, we delve into the art of cultivating inner strength and your permanent resolve, critical qualities for navigating the challenges of modern life. Please listen to Joshua Valentine and Joanne Ashdeen, helping to guide you in fostering a deeper and more intimate connection with your home. So, let's embark on this transformative journey together, unlocking the potential within ourselves and our homes. I welcome you to the Modern Homeowner
Welcome back,
community.
everyone, to the deep dive. You guys sent in a ton of stuff for us to go through for this one. Articles, briefing documents, website stuff, PDFs, all about condos and HOAs in Canada and the US.
Yeah, you weren't kidding. That's a lot of research you've done. Looks like some really interesting stuff in here, though. Should be a good one.
So we're going to do our best to take all this information and really pull out what's important. We want to make sure that, whether you're already living in one of these communities or maybe you're thinking about buying into one, you've got to really understand how they work, right? Financially speaking, but also just like the governance side of it all.
For sure. And it's only becoming, more and more important because we're seeing condos and HOAs and all that, they're everywhere now, right? So whether you're trying to figure out like why your fees went up or you're weighing the pros and cons of buying, it's like you need to understand the basics.
Okay, so let's get into it then. Why don't we start with something that's probably familiar to a lot of our listeners here in Ontario, just the financial side of how condos work.
Sounds good.
So it seems like we can break it down to two main things, right? The budget and the reserve fund.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, those are like the two key things that'll tell you if a condo corporation is financially stable or not. And one thing that really jumped out at me from the stuff you sent over was this. It said that like way too many owners, they don't even read the yearly budget, and even fewer actually like ask any questions about it.
I know, right?
Yeah.
It's wild when you think about it because it's your money, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So how does the budget process actually work in Ontario? Like what's the general procedure for how all that comes together?
Well, typically, like if the condo has a property management company, usually they're the ones who will put together the first draft of the budget.
Okay.
And that's going to have, all the expected income and expenses for like the next year. And then that draft, it goes to the condo board, the directors, and they have to review it really carefully. And then ultimately it's the board that actually approves it.
Right.
So they have the final say on the budget. And then once the board has, given it the thumbs up, then they have to send a copy to all the owners. And that has to happen at least 2 weeks before the new fiscal year starts.
Okay, so you get to see where your money's going, but you don't actually get to vote on the budget itself.
Right. So you don't get to like directly vote on the numbers.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
But it doesn't mean you have zero say. Right. So let's say a bunch of owners are worried about the budget. Maybe they think it's not enough for certain things, or maybe they see some expenses they think are unnecessary. They can actually get together and formally request a meeting with the board to talk about it.
Okay, so you can raise your concerns, but does the board have to listen? Like, do they have to actually change anything based on what people say?
Well, they're not like legally obligated to revise the budget just because of what comes up at that meeting. But, and this is important, at that same meeting that the owners requested, they can actually vote to get rid of the whole board of directors if they think the board's doing a bad job with the finances. So you don't directly control the budget, but you control who does control the budget.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's like some accountability there.
Exactly.
So what about the budget itself? Like when you look at a condo budget in Ontario, where's the money coming from and where's it going?
Okay, so on the income side, most of it, like almost all of it, is going to come from those monthly condo fees that everybody pays. But you might also see some money coming in from other things, like let's say they rent out the party room or some visitor parking spaces.
Right.
They might make a little money from that. Or maybe there's some interest earned from, the corporation's savings. And if there is any money left over from the previous year, that gets added into.
Okay, that makes sense.
And then on the spending side, that covers all sorts of things. It's basically what keeps the building running and looking good. So think about utilities, right? The electricity, the water, all that for the common areas. Then there's administrative costs. And then things like contracts for regular services, landscaping, snow removal, cleaning. And of course, you have to budget for regular repairs and maintenance, plumbing stuff, minor fixes, all that.
Yeah.
Oh, and a big one. They always have to put aside a certain amount for the reserve fund.
Right, which is like the condo savings account for big repairs down the road. We'll definitely come back to that. But what happens if some unexpected expense comes up during the year? Can the board just change the budget whenever they want?
They do have the power to make changes, issue a revised budget if they have to. Like, let's say a repair ends up being way more complicated and expensive than they thought, or if some other big unexpected cost pops up. Sometimes they might even have to do a special assessment, which means the owners all have to chip in extra money.
Nobody likes those.
Yeah.
So if I'm a condo owner in Ontario and I'm looking at my budget every year, what are some of the things I should really be watching out for? Like, what might be some warning signs or maybe some things that are actually a good sign?
Okay, so a big one is to look at how the condo fees have been changing over time.
Okay.
Have they been going up, going down, staying the same? Now, you might think, oh, no increase, that's amazing. But you have to really understand why, right? Is it sustainable? Are they still putting enough money into the reserve fund? In general, like a small increase each year, maybe 1% to 3% can actually be a good thing because it helps to keep up with inflation and make sure that reserve fund is growing steadily. But if you see a really big jump, like 5%, 10%, even 25% in some cases, that should set off alarm bells. It could mean there are some serious problems they're trying to catch up on, like years of not doing proper maintenance. Or it could even be that the board's not spending the money wisely.
And what about if the fees are really low or haven't changed much at all for years? Does that mean they're cutting corners on maintenance?
Yeah, that can definitely be a red flag too. Because you have to wonder, if those low fees are coming at the expense of the building's long-term health, if they're not increasing fees at all and there's no healthy reserve fund, it could mean they're putting off essential repairs. And that's only going to lead to bigger, more expensive problems down the line. And that's going to hurt property values too. So yeah, you want to look at the history and not just this year's number.
Right. So you need to look at the trend, the history of fees, not just the number for this year.
Exactly. You need that context. And speaking of context, you really need to look closely at that reserve fund. How big is it? How much are they adding to it every year? Because that reserve fund, that's like the condo safety net for those big, unavoidable expenses that come up eventually, like replacing the roof, fixing the elevators, major structural stuff. So a healthy, well-funded reserve fund, that's definitely a good sign. And then there's the whole contingency fund thing. Or you might also hear it called an operating surplus.
Right. And one of the things we read said that a contingency fund is basically the same as a surplus, right?
Yeah, that's right. In this context, they're basically the same thing. It's basically the money that's left over at the end of the year after they've paid for everything in the budget.
Okay.
And unlike the reserve fund, having a contingency fund in Ontario isn't actually a legal requirement.
So it's more of a good practice kind of thing.
Exactly. The idea is that it gives the condo a little bit of breathing room financially, right? So if a small unexpected cost comes up, or if they want to make a minor improvement, they can use that money instead of dipping into the reserve fund or hitting the owners with a special assessment.
Makes sense. So a reasonable contingency fund, that's a good thing. But if it's like super huge, is that bad?
Well, one of the sources called those big contingency funds captive funds, which I thought was interesting because it's basically a lot of your money just sitting there in a bank account, not really doing anything for you or the building. And the source also pointed out that it could lead to, how do they put it, lack of fiscal discipline. If the board sees this big pile of money just sitting there, they might be more tempted to, spend it on things that weren't really planned for. Like maybe they suddenly decide to upgrade the lobby furniture, even though there are other more important things that need attention.
Right. So the main focus should be on planning for most expenses in the regular budget, not relying on that rainy day fund for everyday things.
That's exactly it. The source was pretty clear on that. It said boards should plan for expenditures within the regular budget rather than rely on contingency funds. Otherwise, lack of fiscal discipline will prevail and impulsive spending will occur.
Makes sense. So budgets are important.
Good budgets.
Okay. So we've talked a lot about the financial side of things, specifically for condos in Ontario. But I think now would be a good time to kind of zoom out a little bit, because there's so much confusion about the different terms people use.
Yeah, for sure.
Strata, condo, HOA, they all kind of sound similar, but what are the actual differences? Especially when we start looking at, different parts of Canada and the US.
Yeah, it definitely gets confusing. I think it helps to start by looking at where each term is usually used. So condo, that's the most common term, right? You hear it all over Canada and the US. But then you go to BC or even Australia and people start talking about strata. Now, the thing is, strata and condo, they're basically the same thing. They both mean you own your individual unit. And you also share ownership of all the common areas, like the hallways, the gym, the landscaping, all that. In BC, they have a specific law called the Strata Property Act that covers all those types of properties.
Okay, so condo and strata, same basic idea, different names. What about HOAs then? Where do they fit in and where do we usually see them?
HOAs, or homeowners associations, are a lot more common in the US, especially in those neighborhoods with detached houses. You see them in Canada too, but not as much. They're usually in those planned community developments, the ones where the developer has kind of laid out the whole thing from the start. And this is where we get to a big difference compared to condos and strata. It's about what you actually own.
Okay, so what's the difference in what you own when you're part of an HOA versus a condo or strata?
All right, so with condos and strata, you own your unit, right?
Yeah.
And you also own a piece of all the common areas. It's like shared ownership. But with an HOA, you own your property, like your house and the land it's on, but you usually don't own any part of the common areas in the community. Instead, you have the right to use them. But the HOA itself usually owns and maintains those areas.
Okay, so there's a difference between owning a piece of the community and just having the right to use it.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really important legal distinction.
Makes sense. So how does that difference in ownership affect how these communities are run? Like who's making the decisions?
So for both condos and strata, you have what's called a condo association or a strata corporation. In BC, they call it a strata council. And that's basically a group of owners who are elected by the other owners to manage everything. They handle the money, they set the rules, they make sure the common areas are taken care of. With HOAs, it's pretty similar. You have a board of directors, and they're usually residents who are elected by the other homeowners. And they do pretty much the same stuff, governing the community and enforcing the rules.
So in both cases, it's residents running the show.
Mm-hmm.
But there's got to be some kind of rules and regulations, right? It can't just be a free-for-all.
Of course not. So in BC, like we said, they have the Strata Property Act. That's the law that covers all strata properties there. But in other provinces and in the US, they have their own specific laws for condos. Plus, each condo corporation has its own set of governing documents, like a declaration and bylaws. And HOAs are similar. They have their own governing documents too, which are usually created by the developers when they first build the community. But they also have to follow any relevant state or provincial laws that apply to HOAs.
So it's kind of a patchwork of different rules depending on where you are and what type of community it is. And how about the fees? How do those work and what do they cover?
So with all three types, condos, strata, and HOAs, you're going to have to pay regular fees. That's just how it works. And that money is used to cover the cost of running and maintaining the community. Condo and strata fees, they're mostly about the building itself, the shared amenities, and repairs to the common property. And sometimes those fees are calculated based on the size of your unit or how much of the common property you technically own. HOA fees, on the other hand, are usually the same for everyone in the community, and they usually go towards maintaining the common areas that are shared by the whole community, like parks, community centers, that sort of thing. Sometimes they even cover services like landscaping, snow removal, or even security.
So even if you own a detached house in an HOA, your fees might be going towards like the community entrance sign or the neighborhood park, even though those aren't technically on your property.
Yeah, that's right. It just depends on how the specific HOA is set up and what their governing documents say.
Interesting. Let's talk a little more about condominium associations and HOA specifically, both in the US and Canada. What are some of the big picture trends and things to watch out for?
Okay, so with condos, whether it's in the US or Canada, the basic idea is the same. You own your unit and you share ownership of the common areas. And the condo association is there to manage those shared spaces, make sure the rules are followed, and collect the fees to keep everything running smoothly. The good things about condos are that you share the costs of maintenance, you usually have access to amenities you couldn't afford on your own, and there's a system for governing the community. But of course, there are also some potential downsides. You have to pay those monthly fees, there might be restrictions on what you can do with your own property, and there's always a risk that the association could be mismanaged.
Okay, makes sense.
Now, HOAs in both countries, they're also about governing residential communities, whether it's single-family homes, townhouses, or sometimes even condos within a bigger development. They typically set rules about things like how your yard looks, what color you can paint your house, that sort of thing. They also take care of the common areas like parks and rec centers, and they might provide other services to residents too. The benefits are pretty similar to condos. They help maintain a certain standard for the community. The common areas are usually well kept, and they have a way to handle disputes between neighbors. But the downsides are kind of similar too. The fees, the possibility of special assessments, those rules that some people find annoying, and the potential for disagreements about how the rules are enforced.
So it sounds like both condos and HOAs are trying to create a certain quality of life in a shared community, but they do it in different ways and come with their own pros and cons.
Exactly.
And how common are they in both countries? Are there any big differences there?
Oh, yeah, for sure. In the U.S., both condos and HOAs are super common, but HOAs especially have been popping up everywhere, particularly for new homes. The numbers are crazy. They say something like 77 million Americans live in HOA communities. And get this, 81% of all new single-family homes built in the U.S. in 2023 were part of an HOA.
Wow, 81%. That's huge.
Yeah, it's the dominant model for new housing in the States.
What about here in Canada, though? What's the situation here?
So in Canada, condos are definitely popular, especially in big cities where a lot of people live in apartments and stuff. But HOAs are not nearly as widespread as they are in the U.S. You mostly see them in those newer planned communities, especially in places like Alberta and Ontario. And developers often use HOAs as a way to manage the amenities and keep a certain look and feel for the whole community.
Okay, so definitely different trends in the two countries. Now, some of the stuff you sent me also talked about Australian strata schemes.
Yeah.
How do those compare to the condo and HOA models we've been talking about in North America?
From what I've read, Australian strata schemes are basically the same idea as condos and strata properties here in Canada and the US. You individually own your unit, which they call a lot down there, and you share ownership of the common areas. And instead of a condo association or strata corporation, they have what's called an owner's corporation or a body corporate. It's the same concept, just different words.
So individual ownership plus shared ownership and management. Same idea, different terminology.
Right.
What are some of the pros and cons they talked about for the Australian strata model?
The advantages they mentioned are pretty similar to what we talked about for condos here. They said stratas are often more affordable than buying a detached house. You don't have to worry about all the maintenance yourself because the owner's corporation takes care of it. You usually get access to amenities you couldn't afford on your own. You might feel more of a sense of community living close to other people. And there's potential for your property value to go up. Now, the downsides they listed were also pretty familiar. The ongoing fees that owners have to pay, the fact that you might need permission to do certain renovations to your own place, the possibility of having disagreements with your neighbors or the owner's corporation, the risk of those special levies if something expensive comes up, and just the fact that you're living close to other people, which not everyone loves.
Right, so it's all about trade-offs.
Yeah, exactly.
They also mentioned something called Torrens title in Australia. What's that all about?
So Torrens title, it's basically a way of owning land in Australia where you have full ownership of the land and any buildings on it. So unlike strata, where you share ownership of the common areas with Torrens title, you have complete control over your entire property. But that also means you're responsible for all the costs of maintaining and repairing everything yourself. It's a trade-off between independence and shared responsibility.
Right. More independence, more responsibility. Shared ownership, shared responsibility.
Exactly.
Okay, we've covered a lot. Let's try to recap the key differences between condos, stratas, and HOAs.
Sure. So first, the names are different depending on where you are. Condo is the most common term in Canada and the US. Strata is used in BC and Australia, and HOA is mostly a US term, but you see it in Canada too. Second, there's a difference in ownership. Condo and strata owners own their unit and share ownership of the common areas, but HOA members own their property but usually only have the right to use the common areas.
Right.
Then there's governance. Condos and stratas are governed by an association or corporation of owners, while HOAs are run by a board elected by homeowners. As for the common areas themselves, they're co-owned in condos and stratas, but owned by the HOA in that model. Fees for condos and stratas are mainly for the building and amenities, while HOA fees cover community upkeep and sometimes even services. And finally, the laws are different. Condos and stratas are governed by specific condo acts, like the Strata Property Act in BC, whereas HOAs follow their own governing documents and any relevant state or provincial laws.
Awesome. That was really clear. So for everyone listening, what are the big takeaways from all this? What do people really need to remember?
I'd say the most important things are these. First, if you're dealing with condos, especially in Ontario, you've got to understand the finances, know how the budget works, and why the reserve fund is so important. Pay attention to your fees, look at how they've changed over time, and see if the reserve fund is healthy. Second, Even though people sometimes use the terms interchangeably, condos and stratas are different from HOAs in a really fundamental way. It's all about ownership. Knowing whether you actually own a piece of the common areas or just have the right to use them, that makes a big difference. And finally, looking at the Australian system helps you see the pros and cons of shared ownership from a different perspective, because they have their own system, but it's based on the same basic idea.
Absolutely. It's all about being informed, right?
Yeah.
Whether you live in one of these communities or you're thinking about buying in, or you just want to understand how this whole thing works.
Yeah.
So as you're thinking about your housing options, ask yourself, which model really fits your needs and your lifestyle, and why? And maybe think about the long-term financial side of things too, because there might be implications down the road that you haven't thought about yet. It's definitely worth considering. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
I want to take a moment to connect with you. If you are finding value in this content and want to empower your intimate connection with your home, please take a second to like this video. Your support helps me create more free content like this. Also, I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Drop a comment below with any questions or insights you have. Let's create a community where we can learn and grow together. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Our dream is to reach 1,000 subscribers, and with your support, we can reach this milestone together. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on all our latest content, helping you cultivate inner strength and deeper connections in every aspect of your home ownership. Thank you for being part of this journey.